Hello, and thank you for inviting me to come here. I'm super excited to tell you about some work that I've been doing, much of it in collaboration with my graduate students at the University of Oregon. I know sexual harassment is often talked about in organizations in terms of training. People need to be trained. And one of the messages I hope you take away is that we need to put aside training and think about embracing the topic and education, doing what people might call a deep dive, and really understanding what is going on if we really want to make a change on this topic. And I'm going to approach this today with a very brief overview of some data and concepts that I believe will help us understand sexual harassment and what to do about it. And these are interrelated concepts: betrayal trauma theory, institutional betrayal, sexual harassment, disclosure and DARVO, and then institutional courage. I'll start with betrayal trauma theory. This is a theory that I first began to work on quite a while ago in the context of interpersonal violations, abuses that occur between people that are close to each other. And the first intellectual puzzle I had when developing this theory was why people would sometimes seem to remain unaware of a very significant trauma that had occurred to them. They might seem to not realize that they'd been mistreated or abused by a boss, a parent, or a lover. The betrayal trauma theory takes two fundamental aspects of our humanity. And the first one is our exquisite sensitivity to betrayal under certain conditions. And we should be exquisitely sensitive to betrayal because we're a social species constantly making contracts with each other. And when we're betrayed, it's costly and harmful. We should detect it, and we should take protective action so it doesn't happen to us again. That protective action is typically to confront or to withdraw from that particular relationship in order to not be betrayed a second time. These are the responses of an empowered person to a betrayal. At the same time, there's something else about us, which is we are a very dependent creature much of the time. This is extreme in infancy, continues throughout childhood, and actually continues to varying degrees throughout our lifespan and our adulthood. We remain dependent on infrastructures around us. We remain dependent on our government, our employers, our schools. In infancy, we are extremely dependent. We can't live for 5 minutes in the woods without being cared for. This dependency is not unique to humans. Other animals have it as well. And evolution has given us an attachment system to protect the dependent creature. And it works by a system of being reinforced. The caregiver is reinforced by certain behaviors of the dependent other. So this infant you see is smiling and cooing and doing exactly the things that will make adults spend enormous amounts of time and effort taking care of that infant. If the baby can't do those things, the baby's in trouble. What the baby has, very seriously, is a job. The baby has to be lovable, and the way we accomplish that is to love. And the relationship is reciprocal. When it works, it's great. And this continues throughout the lifespan. When you are dependent on your boss, you continue to do things to be appreciated by that person. These behaviors are positive engagement and approach behaviors. So what happens when the caregiver is the abuser? We have here a conflict between two basic systems. And in that conflict is where we get betrayal blindness, because basically attachment trumps betrayal detection. It is too dangerous to be aware of betrayal if you cannot confront or withdraw. You're only going to make your situation worse. It's safer to not know what's going on. And this leads us into a territory where we survive the moment but pay a long-term consequence because we don't see the betrayal around us. My students and I have been researching this for over 20 years, and we have found that betrayal blindness is pervasive. Victims, perpetrators, and witnesses engage in betrayal blindness in order to preserve necessary relationships. We've also discovered that betrayal is extremely toxic, and a very large number of kinds of distress are empirically associated with exposure to betrayal trauma, even controlling for exposure to trauma more generally. And you can see in this graph that we've pulled apart two dimensions of trauma: what's terrorizing, which is what people usually think of, life-threatening, and a social betrayal. A trauma can start out as a terrorizing one, like a hurricane, and turn into a social betrayal when the government fails to take care of people after that hurricane. And what we've found is it's associated with many negative outcomes. We've also found that while men and women are traumatized at about similar rates, that girls and women are at much higher risk of betrayal trauma in particular. What about institutional betrayal? Can people respond to betrayal? Well, first of all, can institutions betray? And if they do people respond to that betrayal in a way that has some parallels to how they respond to interpersonal betrayal? In our first study on this question, we looked at educational institutions. And we defined institutional betrayal very broadly. Institutional betrayal is when institutions are harming those dependent on the institution. This can be very overt, like a government ordering genocide on some of its citizens. But often it occurs through a failure to do what is expected, a failure to protect or prevent when there's a reasonable expectation of prevention and protection. We measured institutional betrayal by creating a new instrument called the Institutional Betrayal Questionnaire. And we looked at the relationship between sexual assault experiences, trauma symptoms, and institutional betrayals. My co-author, Carly Smith, is now an assistant professor at Penn State. But we did this research when she was a brand new graduate student in my lab in 2010. Our Institutional Betrayal Questionnaire started with a simple checklist of the kinds of behaviors institutions might engage in that we would consider institutional betrayal. Importantly, in all this research, we avoid words like betrayal or rape or any stigmatizing words, but always use behaviorally written items so that people will recognize and experience without having to take on a scary label. So institutional betrayal includes things like failure to prevent creating environments where this may be occurring, all the way to punishing people for having experienced the betrayal or attempting to deal with it. What we found was, as with many researchers, very high rates of sexual violence and sexual assault in our college sample. And this has been documented for 40 years. We also found trauma symptoms were related to these sexual assault experiences. Again, not news. What was new was we found that 40% of those reporting sexual assault did also indicate institutional betrayal, and trauma symptoms were associated with institutional betrayal. And this is what the relationship looks like. What I'm showing you here is the amount of sexual assault on the x-axis and the amount of anxiety symptoms on the y-axis. And we see this pattern for other symptoms as well. As sexual assault goes up, anxiety symptoms go up on average. These are averages. But what you see is institutional betrayal exacerbates this relationship. It's added harm. It's harm above and beyond the interpersonal violation. It means institutions themselves can become the source of harm to individuals. We see this as well with physical symptoms. So people are more ill if they've been exposed to institutional betrayal, even controlling for interpersonal betrayal trauma. Researchers at the VA have discovered that if you look at military sexual trauma survivors and you compare those who've experienced institutional betrayal with those who have not, that the military sexual trauma survivors with institutional betrayal experiences have more PTSD, more depressive symptoms, and I think very alarmingly, higher odds of attempting suicide. You may have heard people say, military personnel say, the rape was bad, but what was even worse was how I was treated after the rape occurred. Institutional betrayal is also not good for institutions. The data I've shown you indicates that you're going to have more illness, absenteeism. We have indications it leads to departures from the institutions. And for those who stay, we have data suggesting that it leads to disengagement from the system. People become disengaged. There's also a reputational cost. Individuals who've experienced institutional betrayal are less likely to say good things about the institution to other people. A tip for all of you, when you do your anonymous surveys, which I'll come back to, which you should be doing, you should be measuring institutional betrayal. And hopefully, with time, you will see the rates of institutional betrayal go down. Unfortunately, at my university, where I've been measuring this for a while, I keep getting about 40% in survey after survey. Workplace sexual harassment is usually a form of betrayal trauma. It's usually something that occurs between people that know each other and trust each other. And it's frequently compounded by institutional betrayal. It's associated with numerous negative outcomes. In one of our studies, we found that controlling for other forms of victimization, harassment by superiors was associated with increased trauma symptoms, decreased perceptions of safety, and increased experiences of institutional betrayal. We do have a problem, which is how are we going to stop this if people don't report it? Without reporting, it's just difficult to meet people's needs. And yet, reporting is very rare. In our research with graduate students who'd been sexually harassed by faculty and staff, we found only 6%, leaving 94%, 6% were the only ones who had reported to any university source. Why don't people report? People, although reporting can lead to good outcomes, in fact, it's an extremely risky thing to do. A bad response to a report makes things worse for the victim, both in a practical sense and in an emotional sense. A bad response, in fact, can be a new betrayal trauma. And a bad response from the institution is institutional betrayal. What do bad responses look like? Some are obviously bad. Some are bad even when they're well-intentioned and maybe not so obvious. So harmful responses include not acknowledging, reassurances that minimize the experience, oh, that was so long ago, turning the discussion to the self, probably in an attempt to distract and minimize the listener's anxiety, taking control away from the survivor, I'm going to go do something with this information, blaming, invalidating, and punishing. Here's the good news. We can fix this, at least for well-intentioned listeners. Well-intentioned listeners are often simply unschooled. They simply don't know how to be good listeners because guess what? We don't learn about that. School teaches us all sorts of things, but it does not teach us this. In a study with Melissa Foynes, we found through a very simple intervention, an educational intervention, we could improve listening experiences for people. I've posted some tips and discussion guides on my website, and you're welcome to download them. There's a particularly pernicious response I want to draw your attention to. This is often not well-intentioned, but those of us who are well-intentioned can call it out. It's called DARVO. It stands for Deny, Attack, and Reverse Victim and Offender. Example, deny the behavior. None of this ever took place. Attack the individual doing the confronting. You're a disgusting human being. And reverse the role of victim and offender. I'm a victim. These are in quotes because somebody said those words, somebody very, very famous. In recent research, we have actually begun to measure the effect of DARVO. And here's the bad news. It is an effective perpetrator strategy. It works. It leads to victim self-blame. Victims who get DARVO'd are more likely to blame themselves. And for observers who see DARVO occurring, it leads to decreased perceptions of victim credibility. Now, it's a little nuanced. In fact, DARVO makes everybody look bad a little bit, but it particularly hurts the victim. What can we do about this? At this moment, my best guess is that we can call it out. We can name it. We can raise people's awareness of it. I do have research in the pipeline to actually see if we can measure an effect of calling it out. I think we will. I want to end with some thoughts about how can we prevent institutional betrayal. I've recently outlined 10 steps, and I don't have time today to go into detail in all of these, but I just want to draw your attention to these, and my website contains quite a bit more information. One is comply with the laws. This seems like a duh, but I so often find people are not following basic civil rights law, Title VII, Title IX. So minimum comply, but don't use a compliance mindset because that becomes deadly. No check boxes. Understand the spirit of the law and go beyond mere compliance. Make sure leadership is educated about sexual violence and related trauma. What we're trying to do today, it's really important to understand these concepts so as not to make big mistakes even if well-intentioned. Conduct scientifically sound anonymous surveys. I said I'd come back to this. This is crucial. People will not talk easily about these issues. If only 6% are reporting, that's not usable data. Well-done surveys, and by that I mean experts in the content area who know how to ask about these matters need to be involved in the survey design, and it needs to be administered in a way that creates good data. Respond sensitively to victim disclosures, a huge benefit there. Bear witness, be accountable, and apologize. I didn't have time to talk about apologies, but they can be done, and they can even get past your general counsel and still be sincere. It just takes some time to thread the needle, but it is doable. Cherish the whistleblower. I don't know why we have so much trouble with this, but the whistleblower is your best friend. If they're telling you something's going on in your organization, listen. Don't stick your hands over your eyes, because if you fix it sooner rather than later, that will benefit you. Engage in self-study. In addition to those anonymous surveys, have regular meetings where people actually brainstorm together and question themselves as to whether they are practicing in a way that is benefiting the institution at the expense of the employees, and how to stop that. Be transparent about data and policy. Sexual violence and a lot of corruption thrives in secrecy. To the extent possible, while protecting people's personal privacy, being transparent about the policies and the data will ultimately be very, very liberating for the organization. And then use the power of your company to address the societal problem. If you're in the entertainment business, make documentaries. If you're in the software business, create a product that helps address this problem, whatever your business. If you are at a research university, my goodness, get your research university to support research and dissemination on this topic. And then, of course, as Joe Biden has said so famously, don't tell me your values, show me your budget, and I will tell you your values. Commit resources to these actions. I do think that we can nurture institutional courage. I think this is something we can address. Honestly, I've been researching sexual violence for more than 2 decades. I know it's a hard problem. It's really hard to fix the American family or the family anywhere. And it'll take us time. But we, as adults in institutions that are rich, can in fact make a change just by fixing our institutional betrayal problems. This will reduce the actual victimization and the additional harm. And it's something that we can do. It's going to be better for individuals, better for institutions, and it's a crucial first step. Thank you very much.
That was great, Jennifer. Thank you. Have a seat. Thank you so much. I know you've dedicated your career to this, but it's an especially timely topic, as you know. And I would say that to me, when I review what you've just said and your published work, you've given an explanation for this seemingly, it's like, why does this happen? And I want to thank you for that. I have some questions from the audience, and also some questions that I had, having looked at this a little bit in advance. I guess I want to start off with what I sometimes hear in hushed tones, which is a kind of a countercurrent to this new awareness of sexual harassment and the dynamics for the victim, the perpetrator, the institution. So the countercurrent, or hushed tone conversations are often about the unintended consequences and maybe some skepticism about whether allegations are or are not founded. What are your reactions to that? Well, I'm sure you've heard these too, right?
Yeah, this is a difficult topic, and it's messy, and we will make mistakes. I think in embracing it, in talking about it, there will be some wrong turns. It's important to know that rates of false accusations, this has been researched a lot, are relatively low and similar to any other sort of kind of misbehavior, so typically under 10%. But there are some, and I think we always need to have systems that are fair and convince people that they're fair and protect people from being falsely accused. So we certainly don't want to set up a system that makes it easy to abuse the reporting in a way that people could conspire just to harm somebody, for example. But there will be some, it's painful to talk about these things. It's hard work. I don't think we can avoid that.
I was noting that the checklist of institutional behavior, like bad things, they're all bad things. Is it at least as important or perhaps less important to measure positive behaviors or positive features of institutions?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we have done that. We have a version of the Institutional Betrayal Questionnaire that's the Institutional Betrayal and Support Questionnaire, and you can download these from my website. So far, the support questions haven't been as predictive of outcomes as the betrayal questions, so from a research perspective, we've really focused more on the betrayal items, just because empirically it's more powerful. But there may well be reasons to be measuring support, and maybe our items just haven't been good enough.
I was going to ask you, why do you think that is?
Yeah. I mean, it's possible because the betrayal items are more precisely measuring what goes wrong, and it's harder to measure support other than saying you're not betraying. It may be that.
It could also be that doing a bad thing is, in fact, more deleterious than doing a good thing is helpful.
Yes.
Right? So
yes, and in fact, there's research on rape outcomes that if you look at the details of a rape, it doesn't predict as much how people are functioning down the road as does the response of society to that rape experience. But what's really predictive is the negative response.
As opposed to the
positive. Yeah,
positive.
so it's true.
Yeah. I know that the answer to this may be no, but is there a model organization that you can point to and say, look, let's all be like this institution, nonprofit, for-profit, educational?
Yeah. I wish I could tell you I have found such an institution. I've certainly found instances of institutional courage that have been very inspiring to me. But when I've talked to people at the institutions where I've found those, they've been very quick to tell me, but there are a lot of other domains where they have problems. I haven't found yet, but doesn't mean it isn't out there. And I'm really eager to hear about it if it is.
Maybe at Wharton People Analytics.
Yeah, maybe one of you will tell me about such an institution. I think it's not going to be perfect. Humans make errors, but I think we can get pretty close.
Do you want to share any of those bright spot stories that might illustrate how this can go well? Because I think you've very clearly painted a picture of what it looks like when it doesn't go well.
Well, one that I find particularly inspiring occurred at Oregon State University. Now, I've been at the University of Oregon, which is in Eugene, Oregon. Oregon State is in Corvallis. It's just about 45 miles away, and very similar, really beautiful little towns and similar research universities. At Oregon State University, there was a woman who reported being gang raped in 1998 by some football players. And it's a football school.
She was an undergraduate?
She was actually in the community.
She was in the community.
Yeah. And the university and the police handled it horribly. They lost the rape kit, and they told her she didn't have a strong case. And the football players, there were 3 involved, were told to sit out for a game and do some community service. She went on with her life, paying the price that somebody pays for such an experience, got a nursing degree, kind of went on. And then this amazing thing happened in this country. People started to talk about college sexual assault, and she recognized her story as similar to what was being talked about. she got up the courage to call Oregon State University up in 2014 and say, hey, what happened to my case? I'd like to see my records. And at first she got blown off. She talked to a reporter who wrote a story, and then things really changed because, and this is what's so inspiring to me, the university president, who probably received 50 to 100 forwarded copies of that story, instead of being defensive, took it on. And he ordered an investigation. After the investigation was completed, he contacted this woman, shared the results of the investigation, wrote a beautiful apology letter, and then hired her as a consultant for 2 years. Her name's Brenda Tracy. She's remarkable. And she's gone on to do work all around the country, working with football coaches and teams. But that president, in doing that, I think he just did it because he thought it was a good idea. His name's Ed Ray. And it's just unusual, but he's gotten enormous good PR for it.
I think that, maybe not a perfect institute, but I think that's a pretty good approximation of, holding out an institution. And when I think about the checklist, I think that checks off most of the things that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Which is terrific.
But I have to add, OSU still has work to do.
As I think probably any reasonably sized institution must.
Right.
Let's talk about data. So you mentioned anonymous and scientifically valid surveys, which institutions don't have to do that work of the scientifically valid part because you and your colleagues have done that.
Right.
Is there data other than self-reported questionnaire data that ought to be collected and brought to bear on these questions?
So at this point, self-report data is the best thing we have for actually getting at the true sort of magnitude and detail of the problem. Any kind of official reporting is, as I mentioned, it just tends to be the tip of the iceberg. However, it's still important to be comparing the official reporting with the self-report data. And one of the things we've seen in studies where we've done both of these things, we've learned that, okay, let's say we have 100 abuse survivors, and 6 or 8 of them say they reported. We find that only about 2 of those reports are actually making it through the system, meaning that not only do you have a bottleneck on reporting, but you have a bottleneck on what happens once a report is made. It's dying in the pipeline. That's really important to track as well. So I do think we should be measuring everything we can, but I don't know anything besides self-report right now that gives us the really detailed information.
And those ratios, just to pause a moment on those, I know you're using it as an illustration, but if it's really of the order of magnitude of going from 100 to 6 to 8 to 2,
right.
I think you're suggesting that like the tip of the iceberg is really just the tip and there's this enormous
yes,
mass.
Absolutely.
Great. What about I guess the disincentives for institutions to embrace your 10-step checklist or to follow the example of that university president? You've said something about that, but do you want to elaborate at all on how these disincentives, for example, just reporting, say you do a scientifically valid anonymous survey in your company and you find data that are anything like you've shown in your research studies, you can imagine that would mostly generate negative press, though of course the bravery should be valorized and applauded.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on disincentives?
Yeah, they're there. People do take a reputational hit when they're honest about these problems. At the same time, I believe that the institutions that do that are going to ultimately be well positioned with consumers down the road. So thinking about colleges, for instance, as parents and high school students are becoming more savvy about this issue, they're going to be looking for places where they can get information, can be assured that the university is collecting data. And if programs start to work, we should be able to track reductions over time. It may be that it really does take the consumer incentives to put pressure on companies, but I sure would love a world where companies were doing this because it's the right thing to do.
I wonder if some of the drive to do this might come outside an individual institution or company, but more industry-wide.
Yeah.
Because then you don't have that
Right.
perverse disincentive to
Right.
be the only one who stood up and said, oh, we actually looked at our data and we have a problem.
Yeah, and I mean, keep in mind too, companies can do an internal survey and keep the results internal. And if it makes, if they can use that data to make a better work environment, they're going to reap all the benefits of a healthier, better work environment.
What about betrayal blindness when the betrayal, I assume this question is from the audience, and I assume this is actually usually the case, where the betrayer is a boss or a leader with power over the victim. I assume this is actually very often the case, but
Yeah.
Anything that you want to elaborate on that special kind of dependence which extends beyond maybe other less formal relationships?
I'm not sure I totally grasp the question.
I think okay, so I don't know which member of the audience, but I think the question is about, I guess the added, the reason I'm wondering about, it's almost always a power asymmetry, right? I mean,
right.
I assume, well, let me ask you, is it ever just equals or, the opposite? It's hard
Yeah.
for me to imagine, but where, somebody feels like they've been victimized by somebody who's lower in the
Yes,
hierarchy.
absolutely.
Does that happen? Maybe that's the more interesting question.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
first of all, power is not unidimensional. So you might have more power in your organization by your job title, but have less power because of your social location, maybe your race or your gender or your age, something. So it can be a little complicated, but in general, what we've found is that let's say we're looking at college situation, there's a lot of peer-to-peer sexual harassment. There's a lot of it. But what we have found is that the really harmful kind of sexual harassment is from superior to somebody with less power. So it's just much more powerfully toxic when it occurs. Not that it's peer-to-peer is good.
Right, but it's important to note that also can happen.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, last question, given our time, which is, do you see signs of progress in the #MeToo or #TimesUp movements? What's your commentary on those trends?
Well, yeah, I do see progress. It's been interesting for me because I've been working in this domain for so long, and really sexual violence researchers have kind of toiled in obscurity, I would say, and
Until
even
very
shunned.
recently,
Yeah. I used to marvel that about once a year I would read the same article in the newspaper. I'd read this article and it'd be, researchers have discovered that there's high rates of rape and also that half of the rape victims are actually children. A year goes by, researchers have discovered, and it was like Groundhog Day or something, and I just don't think we could take the topic in. And now I think we are. I think a lot of people think it's just been discovered that there's sexual harassment. I promise you, it's not been just discovered, but it has reached a kind of awareness, like a tipping point, I guess. And to me, that's very exciting because I think social change and liberation works that way, right? It takes a while, there are all these threads, and then you get over some hump, and then it doesn't go away. I hope we won't go back.
I think that is a great note to end on, and thank you for your more than 2 decades of research on this very recently discovered topic.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.